In 2011, fresh off of starting my job at the Internet Archive and excited about what possibilities I could do with documentaries, I started a Kickstarter, the Jason Scott 3-pack, and the idea was that I would be able to do 3 documentaries at once over a number of years, maybe 4 or 5, and after I was done, be able to provide them all to people as a 3-pack or sell them individually, covering subjects that mattered a lot to me and which I'd always wanted to cover. The idea was that maybe that would be the end of my documentary career and I could move on to other things afterwards, having covered all the things that I wanted. That was 7 years ago. And this week, I sent a letter to my backers explaining that I was canceling the project and talking about why. And I think there's lessons to be learned there, and I want to share them with you. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and keeping myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Backtracks FM, Jeff Atwood, William Hearn, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been helping me stay out of debt. I was one of the first people outside of the beta to do a Kickstarter way back then. It was called the Jason Scott Sabbatical, and it was a way that I bridged my life from being a Unix administrator to being some sort of digital historian full-time. People liked the work I'd been doing with the BBS documentary and my presentations and websites, and I was trying to come up with a way to do it all of the time. That Kickstarter went well. I got the money that I needed to walk away from one life and walk into another, and be able to work at the Internet Archive, which was something I never dreamed I'd be able to do. I was so happy when I started working there. When I was working at my previous job, my coworkers were great, but I was working towards the goal of making a small set of customers do things a little more efficiently. Customers who, while perfectly fine, were not going to change the world in any meaningful way. A hotel here, an information service there, the Federal Election Commission. I wanted to be doing things that meant something, and that first Kickstarter had done it. So, buoyed on that, I decided to go for the gold, make 3 documentaries at once. I had said that I didn't want to be 50 years old talking about things that I did when I was in my 20s and teens. And so, turbocharging things, working incredibly hard, I would be able to get it all done before it was too late. People believed in me, and I was so grateful for that. Folks backed the Kickstarter, and they backed it by the hundreds. There were people who were investing in one documentary and people who would invest in all 3. There were a number of people who went above and beyond, investing $1,000, $5,000, even $10,000 in some cases, until it was a 6-figure backed Kickstarter, one of the largest on the site. Buoyed with these Kickstarter funds, I started making investments in equipment and materials and research items so that I'd be able to do all 3 documentaries. Looking back, I was doomed on several levels, or at least I was looking at a lot more work than I expected. But that's always been the way when I look at my materials. When I was working on the BBS documentary, I had told myself it was going to be 6 months of shooting and 6 months of editing. It ended up being 3 years of shooting and about a year of editing. Get Lamp was meant to be a much more focused documentary. That is, it would only be about text adventures. It would be about a certain time with text adventures. I would make reference to a few eras, but not go crazy. I ended up going into the nature of puzzles and the nature of being a writer and what the relationship of the writer to the audience is. I don't know why I didn't think I would do this. It ended up being both a meditative essay as well as a simple history of text adventures. That one ended up being about 3 years of work, including well over 9 months of editing. So somewhere in there, I had this idea that if I worked on the documentaries at the same time, switching between whichever one needed my attention the most at any given time, I'd be able to make it all happen in shorter time. A lot of that comes from the idea that these trips were killing me. I'd be going to somewhere like Florida and then staying there for 4 or 5 days. So in this plan, I would film somebody about 6502 in the morning. I would talk to somebody about the tape medium in the afternoon. And then at night, I'd go to an arcade and interview people or get footage. And I would do that day after day, walking away afterwards with all of the footage that I need. Then when I was editing, again, I could get around the delays and moments when I couldn't figure out what to do next by simply switching to another project, jumping between them as I got inspired. Work on a sequence for one documentary, and then when it got a little bit boring or I didn't understand where it was going to go over to something more routine with the other one, maybe cull through an interview or assemble a bunch of clips in one theme and then leave them and then go back. The idea being that every moment was filled. It was a theory at best, but I had great faith that if I really, really put my nose to it, I could achieve this. So looking back, it's really easy to see where the flaws were in the plan and what worked well. And at the very least, I hope there's some lessons here. First of all, I make a very certain kind of documentary. It's the only thing that I really like doing, and that's making a comprehensive subject come to life, going into not just the people and the history as many documentaries would, but finding the stories and the humanity and the related subjects and then bringing them in as well. I also don't like choosing one person to represent an entire era. If there's somebody who's famous for making a certain kind of adventure game, I want 5 or 6 people who made those adventure games because they're each going to have something to say. It was important to me not just to have Tom Jennings of FidoNet, but to talk to John Medill, who was FidoNet node number 2 and ostensibly was the reason Tom was creating FidoNet in the first place. He was also the creator of the FidoNet logo, and he was also great insight into Tom's relationship to his creation over the years. In the case of a subject like the arcades, you'd want to have not just people who had created arcade games and people who played them. You'd want the distributors. You'd want folks who had done books about it. I wanted academics, modern creators, sound designers, marketing folks, reporters, everybody who had experienced arcades from different positions and putting them together. I wanted a modern touch next to the history, next to the prehistory. I wanted you to walk into this movie with maybe a handful of preconceived ideas or things that were important to you, and then walk out having a whole new perspective and a whole new comprehensive awareness of what was there. This happened for the BBS documentary. It happened mostly for the Get Lamp documentary. It's the kind of movie I want to see and the kind of movie I want to make. But it is very, very hard. People have a lot of different perspectives on their past. There were people in the BBS documentary who it took years to track down and to convince that this was a good idea. There were folks in Get Lamp who ultimately told me no matter how many of their colleagues I brought in and how I offered to do everything to make their story come out clearly and to not have them look bad, they still declined. It's just a lot of conversations, a lot of planning, a lot of putting things together. And once you have the footage, once you've traveled and put them together, it is an intense amount of energy to go through all the clips, assemble them, and start to find the story that you want. There are documentary filmmakers that create the script before they shoot a single frame. They write out what the movie's going to be, and then with very little attempts to do something different, they will go through a 3 or 4 week shooting schedule and force everything into that cookie cutter mold. That's not my deal. The downside, of course, is that shooting 100 or 200 hours of footage to make a 1, 2, or 5 hour movie set, that's an incredible amount of effort. And the resulting footage, while historically important, still is stuff that you have to watch at least twice and probably a dozen times to get what you need out of it. This is one of the reasons that documentaries tend to be pretty focused in scope. Give a somewhat light overview of a specific person or maybe an event or a town, and not much more. It is tough work, and I loved the challenge. I'm just somebody who likes sifting through information, so the actual process wasn't that scary to me. But the time involved, which I thought I could reduce, was going to increase. Looking back now, in a post-mortem, I can see two main factors that changed everything. The first was that I got an offer I could not refuse, and that was to shoot and direct the DEF CON documentary. DEF CON was something I'd been going to for 12 years. It was a fascinating, unique thing, and here it was going to be in existence for its 20th year for just 4 days. So I thought, well, if it's just 4 days, we should be able to just shoot things and produce something pretty quickly. Again, my numbers were way off. In my concern to not have missing footage, I interviewed over 60 people before and after DEF CON, traveling to a dozen cities. At the event, I had a wonderful crew of people, most of them plucked from the Kickstarter backers of the other documentaries, and they shot over 300 hours of footage in 4 days. That footage is unique. It's amazing, really. And the fact that it exists and it's locked away in a vault means that, well, the future is going to have a lot of neat stuff to look at. From this footage, I thought I would be able to create a documentary before the end of the year, about maybe 4 months of work. Of course, it didn't work out that way. It basically took about a year. I clipped things up, started to place things where they needed to go, and after a while I had sequences, and I had a lot of people looking over my shoulder. The DEF CON crew had very strong opinions of how they should be portrayed, and there was a lot of infighting between them over what was important and what wasn't, and who was getting the spotlight and who wasn't. I mean, I stress, nobody ever tried to censor me or take things out or make the whole thing say something it didn't or lie. Everything in there was what I decided to put in there. But there was an enormous amount of friction as rough cuts went off to be seen. When the movie came out, there were a whole set of reactions to it, and it was something I didn't expect, which was people were reacting to the idea of DEF CON as much as the documentary itself. To some of them, it was a well-shot, well-edited movie of something they didn't like, and that took me a while to get used to. As a side note, after that movie came out, I never had another talk accepted at DEF CON again. The other factor is wonderful. It was that my job at the Internet Archive, which I had internalized in some way as being like my Unix administration job, well, it was more than a job. It was a complete shift in lifestyle. When Brewster Kahle hired me at the Internet Archive, he told me in the interview, "We need you to be Jason Scott. That will be your job. Be what you are for us. Do what you need to do. Bring in what people want to see. Provide for them what they should have. Be you." After feeling like that was the easiest interview I'd ever aced, the full ramifications of these statements settled into the fact that, to this day, my waking hours are the Internet Archive. I wake up in the morning, I think about how I can make the place better. I think about who to reach out to. I think about projects that are open or folks who want to donate things or work with us to add things. And I think about communicating with them or tracking them down. Or I sometimes just walk through the place and see what there is that people should know about. I look for the Internet Archive being mentioned on social media, and where it makes sense to, I engage with people. I answer their questions. I sit in the Slack channels of the Internet Archive and I talk to all of my wonderful coworkers. And they're all wonderful. These are people who are working at a place because they believe in it, not because they're trying to get a paycheck or because they're trying to get through the day. They're excited about what the Internet Archive is, and they want it to be something even better tomorrow. We talk about how things can be improved and what can we do better and what needs to go and be refined. There's 1,000 little changes that happen in a year. Not all of them are obvious to the outside world, but they're all aimed at making the Internet Archive the best of what it can be. This is as powerful as it gets. There's always warnings about wrapping your identity in your job, but I like to think that over the course of the last 7 years, my time with the archive has improved both of us. I've understood more about the ramifications and the thoughts behind archiving, and the Internet Archive has changed processes because of things that I fought for or thought were important. When it was first announced that I would be working at the Internet Archive, there was a whole set of people who paid me the highest compliment, which was they assumed I'd always been there. I've tried, as best I can, to live up to that reputation. But after finishing that DEF CON documentary, and after spending months working on the Internet Archive in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of angles, my main 3 documentaries started to run into trouble. There was always something that needed me. Finding time to travel, to put together the stories that I wanted to, it just became more and more difficult. My life, in other words, had truly become, on the creative side, a devastating success. Now, to be sure, I shot footage for all of the documentaries. I did interview people who had really interesting stories. I interviewed John Romero, Bill Budge, legendary programmers. I spoke to people who had been there at the designing of the 6502. On the arcade side, I had spoken to all sorts of creators, and I interviewed people who had opened arcades or did arcade repair businesses or had opened up arcades long ago and closed them down. I was getting to the heart of what I think the movie was going to be about, which was, why do we have fun in these dark places and have for years? I interviewed people about the Mechanical Turk and about amusement parks and what boardwalks were. I was going to build a very long, very interesting story about arcades. I was going to have a film about tape that would talk about this medium being transient and what does it mean that we put culture onto these moving parts and hope that it all stays there a few years later. And I was going to talk about the 6502, but they were happening way too slowly. My backers, I'm happy to say, were incredibly supportive. They wrote me words of encouragement. They listened to me when I explained why things were taking so long. I never felt undue, unfair, or threatened pressure from this. Perhaps that made it worse. So the heart of this, which I want to get to, is how much pressure there is when you put it on yourself and you have a plan and you're not completing that plan. Because that plan, that product, that outcome, that does not really exist, stands on top of everything you do and adds a sour note that tells you that even though you accomplish this work, the other work is still waiting for you and you are failing at not doing it. It can build up. It can take over days. You can lose a day to being sad about the things you've not done instead of being happy about the things you are. So in 2018, at the beginning of it, I told people one way or another, I would decide where to go with the Kickstarter. And as the months went by in 2018, I realized where things were going. I was just not the kind of person who could do the kind of documentaries I would have been proud doing. I looked hard at what had been done to do the BBS documentary. I had primarily abandoned my job. I was doing the minimum amount of work to not get fired, choosing projects over people. And I probably was spending between 20 out of 30 days in any given month working on some aspect of the BBS documentary for years on end. Phone calls, emails, editing, shooting, traveling. It was all for the documentary. The work that came out the other end, I'm proud of, and I'm very happy, and I wouldn't change my choices. That person who would sacrifice everything for a project is gone. Since my heart attack, if I am tired, I go to sleep. If I find myself obsessing about something that won't change in a day, I walk away from it. And if I again find myself at a crossroads of having to decide between a person and a project, the person is going to win. So, a couple days ago, I wrote a letter, explained as much of it as I could to the backers, and then offered 2 different choices. One of them was to give them a refund, which a number of people have taken up, and the other one is for me to work on a project that is within my capability. The project was to put together a package of related items to the subjects I was going to cover, something which they call in the modern era a loot box, a compilation of products and different items that would replace, in some small way, what the Kickstarter was going to provide. So, over the next few months, I'll be putting together these loot boxes and providing them to my backers, and who, I truly hope, can look at what I've done with the Internet Archive and get this small token from me in the form of the loot box, and maybe, at some point, forgive me. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to Adam Green, Mark Pilgrim, James Bekoyanu, and the hundreds of supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me stay out of debt. The shutdown of the Kickstarter and the creation of the loot boxes, which I hope to get done later this year, ends the debt of commitments that I have related to projects. They are not my final projects, but they will end me having to look back at promises I made years ago and letting it weigh on me wherever I've fallen short. My intention, after this chapter is done, is to both write about what I learned through all the projects so that somebody else may benefit from them, and also take on commitments in the future after consulting with others who are close to me to make sure that I see what they see so that I don't find myself once again weighed down in debt.